Hello everyone, we're live from SBC Summit Rio 2026. I have the pleasure to be joined by Simon Westbury, strategic advisor at OneXBet. Simon, how are you today? How are you finding Brazil so far?
I find Brazil fantastic. I got here on Monday. I did have a bit of sleep on Monday because I did 7 flights last week, but I got to explore a bit of Brazil yesterday. It's fantastic. It's a vibrant place, and I think being here at SBC Summit Rio, we're seeing that vibrancy on the show floor. It took me half an hour to get to the stand today, which wasn't a big distance, but there's a lot of energy, a lot of discussions already. So it's the first morning, but it's off to a very good start.
Okay, so and I can't think of a better scenario to be discussing Brazil and Latin America in general. So that's why I want to start this by asking you, how does the new scenario in Latin America where regulation is coming into force in different countries, how does that transition changes the strategic approach of global operators in the region?
I think regulation is always something that is non-negotiable and something that is actually good for the industry and something that we need to engage with operators. And it was interesting, yesterday we launched the SBC Player Protection Index, which focused on player protection within regulation. And we had some interesting findings, for example, that 69% of operators in Latin America are deploying real-time monitoring of player behavior, and 34% of operators are using AI in their player protection tools. And that is actually more than Western Europe, where 30% of the respondents were using AI. So in a way, we can say that Latin America is driving the player protection market. Of course, there's some challenges around player protection within the regulation because it's not always enshrined in the regulation. Of course, it is here in Brazil and Argentina, but for example, in Chile, the player protection isn't written into the regulation. And I think it's always interesting if the operators are the guys who are responsible for player protection. So we're not asking for a one-size-fits-all aspect to player protection, but we do believe that player protection should be enshrined in the regulation. Of course, Latin America is interesting as well because operators were talking about technology as being a barrier to player protection, but 50% of respondents were talking about that actually their customers view gambling as a source of income generation, and that's troubling to us as an industry. So I don't think you need technology to educate players on that. And I think also you have to be aware that, it's a very cash-dominated society in certain countries in Latin America, and only 19% of the operators were conducting affordability checks on their players across the region. So I think there's work to be done. But I think on the final point, we have to understand we've maybe gone through a bit of a honeymoon period of regulation, and we're seeing some advancements around tax regimes and also talk about banning advertising and sponsorship. And I think you have to understand that when you see influence actively promoting regulated markets as being a disadvantage to the offshore market, that's not where we want to be. So I think we've been through a honeymoon period, but we also need to understand as markets evolve, we need to make sure that we're providing a safe, enjoyable experience for players to enjoy their gambling.
And of course, one of the major challenges for any operator when looking into Brazil specifically is that a year into the regulated market or the new regulatory framework, we are already seeing a very overcrowded market. So how does that change OneXBet strategy here, and how do you approach the Brazilian market being so overcrowded, and how do you see it evolving in the next few years?
I think that for OneXBet, when any market we go into, we've got 1X in our name. We want to be number one. Obviously, it's a challenging market, and the company name here is Defy, and we chose that name on purpose because we knew there'd be challenges to enter this market. For us as a company, our strategy to go into regulated markets is based on our product, our digital marketing acquisition tools, and finally sponsorship when allowed. From that, we have the global experience of over 18 years, 3 million monthly players, 35 plus local licenses, a very wide product portfolio, but we combine that with our digital marketing experience globally, and then we apply that locally to the market. So every product is different in every market because every player is different. And then the final component to that is obviously the player protection and safer gambling initiatives that we bring in. I think every market evolves, and I think a lot of this is driven by the crazy world political situation that we live in right now and the economic situation. But I think operators always adapt and we always find a way. And as a company, we're committed to the market and we're committed to regulation globally. And where there are opportunities across Latin America as well that make commercial sense, we will expand into those markets.
And do you think Brazil will remain this overcrowded market, or how do you see how do you see it evolving in the next few years?
I think from my point of view, and I've always said this even from my commercial background, if you focus on what you do and what you do well and worry about yourself, you grow. And I think from our perspective as a company, it's not that we don't worry about competition or we don't look at it. I think generally economics tell you when you've got a crowded market, survival of the fittest. But from our perspective as a global brand, we're always looking to be the market leader. So we're focusing on what we do well, our global expertise, and how we can apply that locally to drive the one expert brand in the market.
And in Latin America, with these regulatory changes over the last few years, is the strategy still around player acquisition, or has it evolved into more of a long-time value and retention strategy?
I think that depends on your maturity in the market. Obviously, in Brazil, we went live in October, so it's about acquisition. But even when you're acquiring players, you need to retain players. Otherwise, you just have churn. So I think I'll generalize that question if you don't mind. And I'll say that actually acquisition and retention are equally important in any market. And as you evolve, there's no point acquiring players if you're losing players. So I think, yes, of course, acquisition is always a key component of what you do, but retention and our digital marketing tools to ensure that the players that we have and the personalized experience we give them maintains that they stay and enjoy their experience with us is equally important. I don't think you can put one over the other, but obviously you have to understand when you enter a market, acquisition is key.
Right. And of course, everybody across the entire Americas, everybody from Europe, or where the more mature operators and markets are, is looking into the Americas, Brazil, Latin America, the Americas in general, as a big opportunity. But what do you find are the most misunderstood characteristics across the region that operators have when approaching Latin America or the Americas in general?
I think there's a challenge here, and I think particularly Western operators, when they're trying to enter this market, they've not learned the lessons of the past where they try and have a one-size-fits-all. I think from a one expert perspective, we are obviously a global company, but we have a local dedication to what we do with local personalization, local support teams. We have companies on the ground, we have staff on the ground, and we're here and we commit to the market. I think a lot of operators, maybe from Western Europe, come to these markets, think they know everything, are going to be very big and don't understand the market. So I think it's not just the Americas. Like we're a global company. We're very big in Africa, but our product in Africa differs very vastly from our products in Latin America and also in Europe. So I think it's actually understanding the local intricacies and specifics of the market and making sure your product drives from that. And obviously where we can, we combine that with our sponsorship. Now we work with global brands like FC Barcelona and Paris Saint-Germain in Africa. And we've got local deals, one in here in Brazil at the moment, and we have deals in Venezuela, etc., and Peru with leading teams, because this builds trust in your brand. If you can have the great product and you can have great digital acquisition, but when you enter these markets where your brand may not be known, you have to build trust. So that's why I talked about the 3-pillar approach: product, digital marketing, and sponsorship where possible.
And of course, you mentioned the one-size-fits-all approach, which is, of course, it doesn't work because there are many regulatory frameworks that are developing in the region, across the Americas. Every country has their own. It's not like everybody thinks, or most people think about LatAm as one market, but it's actually several markets, and each have their own regulatory framework. So how do operators balance compliance and responsibility with commercial agility?
I think that's kind of driven by the regulation at the end of the day. You have to play within the confines of the regulation. As an operator, we're not asking for a one-size-fits-all regulatory approach across the Americas, because every player is different and every dynamic is different. What we are always looking for is engagement with regulators and understanding that it's in no one's benefit to drive players to the offshore market. So we're committed to player protection, as I've spoken about, but maybe LatAm's had a bit of a honeymoon period of regulation where it's come in and everything's gone well and the market's growing, but you don't want to strangle that market. So you don't want, overly intrusive tax. I'm not saying we don't want to pay tax. Of course we want to pay tax, but we want to pay tax that is commercially viable for the operation and doesn't put us at a weakness to the offshore market, because actually it's in no one's interest, as I said earlier, to drive a player to an unprotected offshore market. So I think as the market evolves, operators need to engage with regulators and governments and society in terms of CRM projects to show that we are an industry that is focused on entertainment, but a safe player environment as well.
And right now we are facing one of the most important tournaments, probably the biggest sports tournament in the world, which is the FIFA World Cup, which is happening actually in North America. So, how big of an opportunity is it that the World Cup is happening in the Americas, and what challenges does it bring for sports betting operators?
I think that the challenges vary from operator to operator. You know, if you're a Western European operator solely, then you have the time zone difference. But I think I always say we're in the entertainment industry and the excitement industry, and the World Cup drives entertainment and it drives excitement. So that drives us to give an ability to include that in our product and make sure that our players, newly acquired and existing, carry forward that entertainment and excitement from the World Cup into our product and have an enjoyable, safe experience.
And Simon, of course, speaking of the World Cup, I can't help but asking, do you have any bold predictions for the World Cup?
I think a bold prediction would be for England to win, but I know
That's very bold of you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm getting older now and I really want to see England win the World Cup. My head says, of course, it'll be a challenge. It'll be interesting. My heart will always say England, but I think, look, it's a festival of football. It's a global event. And I think as long as the great thing about live sport is it's unscripted and no one knows what's going to happen. So I think everyone should just enjoy it, go on the roller coaster of emotions that it will be and see where we end up.
And we're all expecting the World Cup, but what can we expect from 1xBet in 2026?
I think, look, across the globe, we are committed to more and more regulated markets. There's an exciting announcement coming about some new developments that we're doing in May of this year, which I'm sure we'll be letting SBC know about. So I think it's just more growth, more licenses, and making sure that we are number one in the markets that we operate.
Simon, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Always.
Stay tuned to listen more about the gambling industry here live from SBC Summit Rio. We'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.